Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 125, where we are going to talk about the challenges and the benefits of being open and honest with yourself and your partner, specifically for men. Why it's hard, why it's so important in relationships. And really what I mean by being honest with yourself and open with yourself is it's another facet of self-awareness. So one of the things I hear from a lot of my clients is they feel like their male partner isn't super self-aware, particularly when it comes to sort of more quote unquote difficult aspects of themselves. And because of that lack of self-awareness and ability to kind of see what's going on inside of themselves and around these harder things, it can lead to difficult interactions and lots of disconnection and conflict. So I've already gone into some depth on sensitive self-awareness in a pretty recent episode and being transparent, authentic, and open with yourself as a sensitive woman. You can find both of those episodes, within this last year, 2023. But this episode is meant for you to, as a highly sensitive woman, understand why being really honest with themselves might be hard for your significant other, particularly if he's a male or socialized as a male. And this episode is for your partner, your willing partner only, right? If he's up for it, to listen to, in order for him to hear directly from other men who have learned how to do this and have faced the challenges of doing it and are now experiencing the rewards of having built this, really what we think of as a muscle of self-awareness and self-honesty. Which brings me to the two special guests that I have brought on today. The first is Casey Desharnais, and you'll hear his conversation with me first, and I'll do a better introduction in a moment. And the second is Will, my husband. I thought it would be fun for you and useful for all of you to hear an expert, this is Casey, on the topic of men and relating with themselves and relating with others. So he's going to share all sorts of wisdom and tips and understandings for both of you and your partner. And then we'll talk to Will, or you'll hear me talking to Will. And I thought that would be fun to offer his perspective because he has no sort of training in this field, particularly of human psychology and personal development, but he has been doing a lot of it in the realm of our relationship for quite a few years now. And a lot of it's been hard for him. He's just very much a regular guy in the process of learning to be more self-aware and be in relationship in a more and more connected and loving way. So I thought he'd be a great example for everyone to hear from. All right, with no further ado, let's dive in. I want to give a warm welcome to my friend and colleague, Casey Desharnais. Some of you will remember his name and be super excited to have him back. He and I made a very popular podcast episode a couple years ago about revolutionizing men, their feelings, and love. That's episode 7 for those of you who haven't heard it yet. It's such a good one. So I'm super happy to have Casey back here on the podcast today. He is a depth coach and an IFS practitioner who guides men to establish and maintain contact with their humanity, complexity, shadow, and power. I love that. He focuses on developing self-leadership and the skills to live as a relational human. So what a perfect guest to have on this podcast where we do a lot of the same things. So welcome, Casey.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. I'm happy to be here. Honored.
Yeah. So glad. So happy to have you here. So this podcast, this episode today is about being honest with ourselves. And I would love to establish what that actually means, right? What does being honest with ourselves mean? And I think there's some other terms that can maybe are useful or helpful or more useful to talk about this. One of my favorite. Totally. Yeah. So one of my favorite terms is being transparent, authentic, and open with yourself, with oneself. That sort of looks like being willing to take sometimes hard and honest look at our own selves, at our own roles, and specifically in the challenges with our spouse, and being able to own them, being able to kind of step back and observe how we ourselves are contributing to perhaps the hard stuff, how we're communicating, how we're reacting, how we're turning towards connection or away from connection in our relationships, right? And really just being willing to see what's going on inside of ourselves that leads to that. So what do you think? How do you like to think about this?
Yeah, I love that. So being transparent, authentic, and open is a great way to say it. And it sounds right, like what we're talking about is being transparent, authentic, and open with yourself in the setting of relationship and what comes up. And one of the ways I say it is, what parts of yourself are you going to meet? What parts, what unknown complexes within your own system are going to present themselves when challenges appear, or when you go into a place maybe you haven't been before.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's kind of uncharted territory. And it's like, how do we meet that? How do we meet that within ourselves?
Yeah. And it's also interesting, right? It's like, how do we meet that within ourselves? And how, within the context of relationship, do we also kind of live from there or communicate some of that, right?
Yeah. How do you communicate, going into those parts of yourself and meeting pieces of yourself that are challenging to meet, or that feel uncomfortable or feel unknown or uncertain, you're not quite sure what to do with.
Yeah. And one of the things so I've been working on one of the next podcast episodes. It is about defensiveness. And I think this is a great, just to give people an example of what I'm thinking about around this, at least, is, for example, all of us can be defensive here and there, right? And some of us can really fall into that tendency. And if we aren't willing to kind of look at what's creating that, right? Or what in the moment, and even deeper than that, is kind of leading to being defensive, it's really hard to be less defensive and ultimately learn how to communicate and connect better with our person.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And defensiveness being that thing we do when we're trying to protect our perception or our place in the relationship, when we're kind of afraid of being perceived as having flaws or doing something wrong, or doing something that might have hurt our partner. And so in those moments, we're trying to protect the connection when we're being defensive, protect our place in the connection. But a lot of times the defensiveness is actually doing the opposite, and it's creating it's creating more disconnection.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and it's like a fragility as well. It's a projection of fragility onto the relationship that this connection won't be able to tolerate if I do make a mistake, I won't be welcome here if I make a mistake, or if I mess up, if I do say something out of spite that hurt my partner.
Yeah. And that's like, we're going to get deeper into this part, but what you're touching on is really one of the reasons it's so difficult to be transparent and authentic and open with ourselves. And and also with our significant other sometimes. So let's circle back to that, but let's first just look at, and I'm curious for you, your opinion about this, but I believe it's super important to be able to be honest with ourselves, to engage and meet those harder parts of ourselves, and to be transparent with ourselves around it in our relationships, right? For example, in order to, for example, not be defensive and cause more disconnection, right? So I'm curious, like for you, what do you see as the reward of being willing to take this kind of honest look at our inner world in terms of how we're showing up in the relationship?
Yeah, I think there's many, many rewards. One of them is just you're getting to know yourself in a deeper way. Two, it's the very definition of being relational, or being able to be in relationship and maintain connection through deeper layers of complexity and deeper layers of getting to know one another and shifting and changing. And the dynamic nature of a relationship is, meeting parts of ourselves and bringing them in, bringing them in. And if that's kind of not able to be done, it's a lot of times I think what happens is we hit like a depth ceiling. We kind of hit this place where we can't go any deeper unless we engage with these parts and allow them to be known to us and to the relationship or the partnership, or at least, taking to a therapist, a coach, a friend, an ally somewhere, worked with a bit, and then brought back in, because those layers, getting to know those deeper layers is how we stay in relationship.
Totally. It's really the essence of intimacy. And so many of us, especially as sensitive women, just absolutely adore and thrive on when our partner is kind of open and vulnerable with us. So lets us see them, even if it's the difficult parts of them, right? And that is a way of truly letting us in. And without that, it can feel like I have experienced it. And to me, it's always felt like a metaphoric wall between me and my partner when that starts showing up more.
Yeah. I mean, so many men kind of get that as a concept, but maybe not really on a nervous system level or an engagement level. They get the vulnerability as a concept. And there's elements of like relationality for many men not having known the visceral experience of when I bring some of those things, that there's still connection and safe contact. Many times it's more been like I bring these more kind of uncertain, vulnerable pieces of myself, and it creates disconnection or distance or like an uncomfortable place. And so I'm not sure what to do with it because it's always created some sort of distance.
And what do you think is going on there when that's been the experience? Like why? Because it's interesting, right? Because as I'm listening to you, I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. And my experience of working with so many women is that so often when their partner does show up so vulnerably and with ownership, right? Because owning like, oops, I was being defensive there. This is what's going on for me. I'm sorry. Like that's ownership and vulnerability kind of wrapped in one, right? And being honest with ourselves. And so many women just like are able to meet that with so much more like love and acceptance and compassion than when, for example, their partner's just being defensive and closed. So I totally hear you and I totally believe what you're saying, but I'm curious, like where are men having this experience where they're not being met well, where they're being met in a not welcoming, kind way? You know what I mean?
Well, that's a big question, and it's hard to make a generalization on it. But you know, I think there is probably for, you know, I'm 44, and for my generation, for maybe, you know, 10 years younger, there's definitely a certain cultural aspect to it where, you know, relationality for men growing up was not necessarily, didn't include those vulnerabilities and, you know, discomforts and, you know, places where you didn't quite have it figured out, or places where maybe you'd leave yourself open to being attacked. And there's a big emphasis on being able to get it right and kind of know it all and be a lone wolf and figure it all out on your own. And,
totally.
you know, all these kind of like very non-relational things that were championed as, you know, a sign of, you know, having it all together, which so there's this undercurrent within a lot of men that, you know, going there is, they've not known the safety of like, hey, when I bring something hard, or when I bring something about me that I've traditionally concealed and hid because I felt like I would be outed as being like less attractive, you know, less manly, less like having it all together. So I've hid and concealed what I'm actually confused about, or what I actually don't have figured out, because I've imagined that it would create disconnection, where not many people have had the experience of bringing that to a connection, even a friendship, and having that be met with like, cool, I love you. And how can, like, we figure this out? Like, how can it be okay for flaws to be there, and to be loved, and to be paid attention to, and to be figured out, and to be brainstormed around, you know?
Yeah. I just was thinking, like, you know, you said something about our generation of males, like, but I think that's everything you've been saying is still true for men. Like, you and I both are raising sons, right? And I don't know, I see maybe some progress in that realm, but I still see a lot of the sort of cultural conditioning, keeping men and boys from learning how to be really transparent, authentic, and open with themselves, and meet themselves in those places.
That's like the ultimate gift, if we can give that to our kiddos.
Totally.
I just heard a friend tell this story, and she was saying that her and her husband and their kids were going to the airport. They had a flight out, and they both had things to get back to. And they got to the airport, and her husband had forgotten his backpack, and it had all their wallets and their passports and like all the stuff they needed to fly. So they weren't taking a flight that day, obviously. And, you know, she said she saw that look come onto his face, that you know, she could see the shame, like, I messed up. How could I do it? You know? And she was like, that was a moment when I realized, like, I could give my partner love in a place he hadn't really received much love before.
That's a beautiful little story. And and that's exactly what I was just thinking about, is how, like, if men, so those of you who are listening out there, and I say this with so much love, like, if you are unwilling, because it's scary, and it makes sense that it's scary and feels unsafe, but as long as you're unwilling, right, to show that or express that, it's less likely you'll ever be met by that kind of response from your partner.
Yeah. So do you mean express the kind of shame that's happening, or
or just
get it all right?
And it doesn't sound, you didn't talk about like whether he said anything or she just noticed it, which is amazing, right? Yeah. But one of the benefits of actually being willing to be uncomfortable and express and share and look honestly at oneself and then share it with your partner is that you actually get the real chance to experience that person, your partner, meeting you with like love and acceptance and all the good stuff, right? Yeah, without being willing to do that, you're way less likely to get that experience.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Traditionally, the story we, like many of us have told ourselves about those parts is like, oh, those are the parts that won't be loved, right? Those are the parts that I should hide, or my partner is not going to want to see. And to have the disconfirming experience of, bringing, like, actually, I feel ashamed right now of myself for forgetting something, or I feel like I should be doing more. I'm not living up. And to have that be kind of blanketed with a sense of compassion and love is those moments are where the action of love really comes alive. The deeper, not just the feeling of like, I have the warm fuzzies. I love being around you. You make me happy. It's like, no, this is where the action of love actually, where the rubber meets the road, and we get to like share that. No, I love the global you, the deeper you, your soul, your heart. And I expect you to make mistakes and to have pieces of yourself that are imperfect and flawed. And I can love that about you. And for someone to feel that can be such a deepening experience, and such a, honestly, a bit, it changes the mindset, right, of how we look at ourselves, the many times maybe the incorrect way we see ourselves.
Exactly. And I also think what is so beautiful what you're saying, and I think also the woman, if we're talking in these terms, in that situation also gets a beautiful experience, because she gets to feel like she's so trusted that he's willing to share with her in those ways.
She gets to feel like she's so trusted, and that's cool. It's a real intimacy too, right?
Like,
it's real.
I like oftentimes call this like deep human love, right? Like it's like a love that encompasses like the full spectrum of who we are as humans. Getting a little deep and philosophical, but
totally. That willingness to reveal, to take that risk to reveal and to share, and to like maybe, say something you haven't said before, or, be open about something that's going on inside you that you've been very afraid to share before. It does start to represent like a willingness to take care of yourself, and to have some grit, and to have some resilience in meeting parts of yourself. And then this step of like, oh, I can not only reveal this, but I can work with, parts of myself that keep me open to deeper levels of intimacy. So I can kind of like manage myself and want to show up for the connection, and want to show up in deeper ways for the relationship. I don't need my partner to manage me when I'm not caring for myself.
Yes, totally. That's beautiful. I'm curious a little bit, just to kind of drill down into really just following up on what you were saying earlier, but like drilling down into shame a little bit more. And, you and I talked about this a bunch on our first podcast episode together. I think in my work with women, I see it can be hard for them, for all of us, right? As human beings, it can be hard to be transparent, authentic, and open with ourselves and with others. And I'm curious, though, if you have found that it might be harder for men versus women. And I would venture to guess that because of what I've seen, but also because of how, especially as sensitive women. So I don't know, like we tend to be very self-reflective and kind of like we want to be engaged with those parts of ourselves to some degree. And again, based on the cultural conditioning and, conditioning that men have as they grow up in this world, in this society, my guess is that it would be harder for men. And that a lot of that has to do with shame. So I'm just curious if you wanted to share anything about that.
Yeah, for sure. Like shame is the blanket of silence. It's, I think one of the ultimate ways to control humans is shame and guilt. And a lot of times I think the internal world of a lot of men and how they learn to control the more emotional, sensitive parts of themselves that they felt they couldn't let be seen was through shame. And like those things needed to be eradicated and fixed or cut off from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's almost like a deep shame for even having those things. And how can I fix them? When I start to work with men, a lot of the language is around, well, how do I fix this?
Totally.
Even that is like something's broken, right? Which is shame.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's actually a non-recognition of that those parts are not shameful. They're just parts that need to be understood and worked with and flushed out of it, and they're part of being human.
Exactly. Yeah. When that's kind of under the surface, when that's sort of the way that we are relating to our harder stuff, right? Of course, we kind of just want to almost pretend it's not there, not look at it, right? Because underneath that, first we have to, to be willing to look at it means we may have to experience or notice on a deeper level that the shame is there and the harder feelings are there.
Yeah, right. We have to recognize that imperfections are there or things that, I think even it's a way to control those things from coming into our conscious reality because they may feel so uncertain and they may feel big and unknown. And folks may have this kind of imagination built up around that. Well, if those things come in, I'm going to be a mess and I'm not going to know how to interact. I'll be vulnerable and people will take advantage of me and I'll be manipulated, etc. And it's a deep, there's also the deep fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
The uncertain, because right in a relationship, these places are going to come up and, the edge of what you've experienced within yourself when you're in a deep relationship is going to get pushed and you're going to get exposed to big pieces of yourself that you've maybe not known or haven't interacted with in a long time. So all of a sudden you're interacting with something that you're like, whoa, I don't know. I've not navigated this. Now all of a sudden I'm navigating it with someone else. And how do I do that? How do I present it? How is this going to be accepted?
Yeah. So one thing I really hear is that it's scary.
Totally. Yeah.
Just to put it really simply, right?
Yeah.
It's really scary.
Absolutely.
It's really scary. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, there's parts of me in relationship that, I like your terminology here. Sometimes there's narratives within me that weave stories. And then I believe those stories that say, well, you don't want them to know, this part of yourself that maybe you're feeling disconnected right now, or you're not feeling totally present or, or like you feel, sad when they're happy or something, and it's like, I'll weave this story. These parts of me will still want to weave this story that, I should hide them. That those pieces are not welcome. And, I really need to make, and if I bring them, they'll create disconnection. And I really have to create the grounds for connection to be solid because I'm imagining those parts of me are imagining it to be fragile.
Yeah. So it sounds like you have some personal experience with all of this. Being a man in this society, if it was hard for you at one point, not to say that it's not hard. Now it's still hard for me sometimes, right? Like, of course it's hard. How has that evolved for you? And do you find, my hunch is you're you've grown in that way, or you're somewhat decent at this. I'm just guessing. I could be wrong. But I know in our conversations as friends, I've felt your beautiful capacity to be vulnerable, open, transparent. And so I imagine that's something you've grown at. And I'm also curious, like how, like what you find the benefits of that are for you and those in your life.
Oh man, so many, to start. Yeah. Like I used to be the master of concealment. I used to hide everything that I thought was an imperfection within myself.
Mm.
I used to try to present only the sides I viewed as positive, and really didn't have much experience or have the visceral knowing of what it means to have flaws and imperfection in relationship, or friendships, and so, it evolved for me through starting that process of revealing parts of myself that I thought for sure. I thought, I was convinced that people would, once they heard this, they would basically turn and walk away. That's the story I held in my body. And when I started doing that with first my own coaches and therapists, and then with my friends who are men that I met in men's groups. So also people that were into the work and had some practice in being vulnerable with themselves and opening to their own parts and vulnerabilities and shadows. So, and getting love on the other side of that, it really made me realize that I remember this one day having this, what seemed like this amazing realization that like, oh, these flaws, like they don't make me less of a human. I'm not, I don't need to think of myself as less. And in fact, the truth is, and the true resilience is, I want to claim my imperfections as part of my life and part of my learning, part of my resilience, and part of being a person who's, and just realizing that the honesty of that and the claiming of that as part of my right as a human person to have these things, it all of a sudden turned into almost like a thing of like that self-validation, like, yes, oh, like I claim the right to get it wrong. And if someone I'm in relationship with reacts horribly to a side of me that is a fault or something, I don't need them to validate that. And, I likely probably wouldn't choose to stay in relationship with that person anymore if that was the experience. But most of the experience has been positive. Most of the experience of me sharing pieces of myself that are imperfect, or places I have fears, places I've made mistakes in the past. They've been met with love. Yes. They've been met with acceptance and like, oh, that sounds like a human thing.
It's beautiful.
And it also takes some risk, takes some willingness.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing is, and certainly it's been my experience, and it was kind of what I was saying earlier, but you just illustrated it really beautifully, is that, as you first were able to find some ultimately self-love within it, self-validation around your full humanness, right? The hard stuff alongside the good stuff. And then you were able to kind of be able to share that, right? Expose that to other people. And you were met with with positivity, with kindness, with acceptance, with love. Like that's how we do get to feel safer. That's in our whole body, mind, heart systems, right? Like that's one of the ways. It's a beautiful way. When we start getting that feedback, like, oh, we are actually safe to share, right?
Yeah.
And then it becomes easier.
Yeah.
And that really just leads me into like, my next kind of question or around this for you is like, how can a partner who's noticed that her significant other has a hard time being transparent, authentic, and open, and with himself and with her, do you have any suggestions on ways to kind of help invite him engage more with that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the individual dynamic in a couple. But one thing that I've realized, and I've heard now from friends who are women in relationship, I don't know about, relationship experts maybe, is that I think a lot of us men don't quite realize the capacity of our partners or women to be uncomfortable. Yeah, and to navigate waters that feel like they're uncharted, and to navigate things that maybe we don't have totally locked down. Yeah. So I think there's a couple things. Is the safety is kind of paramount, and creating a safe space for that to happen. And like one of the ways to do that is, he doesn't have to have it all figured out. Even if he just says what's happening in that moment or close to that moment, and that may be, that may be the starting off as the very most basic thing. Like, I just feel shut down. I feel like I want to go away, or I feel defensive, or I feel like if I say anything, you're going to be mad at me, or you're going to disconnect from me.
Yeah. So just like these sort of simple, so this is for something he can do. Is simple. Just sort of openly say, this is what I'm feeling. I actually had a woman client, she shared about this. She was an interview on one of my podcasts. She shared how she actually had a really hard time being vulnerable and sharing these things. And so we came up with this approach that all she had to do was say the emotion she was feeling, or like defensive or hurt, right? Or like what you said, I feel defensive right now. I feel sad right now. And keeping it that simple was so helpful for her and her husband.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is I think room for real simplicity, and not expecting that to lead towards conclusion right away, or some like huge knowing of the whole complex of what's going on within someone, but just room for simplicity in the beginning as they're starting to root some of this out.
Yes.
As people start to develop a relationship with the parts inside themselves that are, not known well yet, and that have big reactions, or have big defensiveness, or, want to isolate, isolate for protection, or step away for even punishment. Like, these are all like things that it takes effort to kind of like be with and get to know within ourselves. And I just encourage people that's one of the things I work with a lot with my guys, is encouraging them to start to develop the relationships within themselves, with these different parts of themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. It's got to start there.
Yeah.
And absolutely. I did a whole podcast called Transparent and Authentic and Open with Yourself. And that's for my women, of course, but it's very much the same idea. And learning how to just engage with oneself that way without, you don't even have to start by communicating anything to anyone else. Right.
Right.
But just being willing to look inward and reflect and investigate.
Journal. Take that away and go journal. A lot of times journaling leads to, things popping out that really you didn't realize were under there.
And I think it's so important too, as we do that. This is what I teach so much for any human being, right? Is like to meet it without judgment. I mean, I think that's the hardest thing, right? Because we've been socialized to be judge our own selves, right? Mm-hmm. And so being willing to kind of step into what I think of as the compassionate witness, or simply an observational place, like as if you're a scientist, like just looking at something, observing something with neutrality, can be really, really helpful as a starting place too, is just being almost like committing to yourself that I'm not going to look at this with self-judgment and self-criticism. I'm going to look at this from a neutral place and just be willing to see it.
Totally. Yeah.
Another thing that just popped into my mind too is, this is a lot of what I teach just in the piece about, how can my women listeners sort of support their partner and learning how to be honest with themselves in these ways and engage with these parts of themselves and open up about them. I mean, I think one of the most simple things that I teach a lot is actually just leading by example, right? Like being willing to do that first on our own selves, and ultimately communicate from that place so that we're modeling that this is okay. This is safe to do in this space. And then, of course, meeting if, when, and ever your partner is open and honest and transparent, right, with you, or even just like shows it on their face, like something coming up, like the story you shared. Obviously meeting them with kindness and in one form or another, showing that they're safe to share.
Yeah. Modeling is an amazing way to do it, especially over expectation. Modeling is also modeling a sense of like, self-safety. Mm-hmm. Saying like I'm willing to admit this about myself or something I'm doing or how I'm judging myself or you, or then that is safety. Because I think a lot of times another thing that's probably helpful to realize is that many times when men in relationship hear, could you do this different, or I would love it if this happened, unfortunately what sometimes is heard is that you're not doing it right.
Exactly.
And you're not getting it right. You're not doing it well enough. You should know this, etc.
Yes.
And then he goes into the pattern within himself of like, I'm not doing it right. Mm-hmm. Seems like I can never get it right.
Yes.
Because there's been this emphasis in men to get it right and to not have these snags and hooks that are imperfections.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is, it's an unfortunate thing lurking beneath the surface. And I think it would be helpful for so many men to hear, like, I really don't want you to get it right. I don't need you to get it right.
I love that.
In fact, fuck getting it right.
It's great.
Please.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. I really love that. I love that. And like, that's such a like great thing to outwardly say and do. Totally. And also I think so key, right, is being able to do that for ourselves. Like you said, like both as women and as men, being willing to have that kind of relationship with ourselves.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Another thing that could be really helpful is a man to have a limit, or to say, hey, I'm overwhelmed. Like, I don't know how to talk about what's going on right now, and I need a little bit of space and time, or I want to figure it out. And that even when you say that, there might be protests still.
Yes.
And that's okay.
Yes.
It's okay to have a limit. It's okay to, not be able to figure it out beyond where you're going in that moment.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's an okay thing to say and a boundary to set. And I kind of need you to love and respect that and give me the space to do that. And that creates a space for actually more love to occur.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. And setting those boundaries is so important, as well as for those women out there listening. I know in the moment it can feel really almost urgent that you figure out more, or you move through this discomfort that might be coming up from your partner being like, hey, I can't, engage around this. I'm overwhelmed. I need some space. I know that can feel completely uncomfortable, but it's also something you really want to honor. And that does mean, supporting yourself through those uncomfortable feelings that might come up, by letting him have that space and by honoring his need for space. So
yeah, totally. Yeah. And there is responsibility there too. There's responsibility with both parties. Like if, as a guy, you're saying, hey, I'm like unsure what's going on. I need more space. This feels overwhelming, etc. And then you go and you don't take any action to try and figure it out further. That's not really stepping up.
True.
If you're, if you're maybe doing a meditation, you're journaling, you're listening to a podcast, you're calling a friend, you're meeting with a therapist or a coach. I mean, you're investigating, you're putting some further effort into, deciphering what's there, and building a deeper connection with that part of yourself, so you can understand yourself. Or because ultimately understanding yourself in a more developed, deeper way leads to you having more resilience, capacity, and power and autonomy in your relationships. Yeah, it's going to take a little bit of effort.
Yeah, it does require being willing to feel some discomfort, and the reward of what it brings is so huge in terms of not just ultimately how you are able to feel about yourself, but how you're able to be the reward in the love and connection that can blossom in the relationship that you're in.
Yeah, big reward, big risk, big reward, or seemingly big risk.
Exactly. And one of my favorite ways of putting that is you trade a little bit of short-term discomfort for a lot of long-term comfort.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Well, beautiful. Casey, this has been such a rich conversation.
Yeah, it was awesome. I love that.
So thank you so much for being here, for sharing all that you've shared.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Tell me, for those listeners who are interested, where they can find you to hear more, learn more about you and your work.
Yeah, sure. So I have a website, CaseyDesharnais.com, but I also do a lot of work with an organization called Man Talks. I'm the coach under the organization. We run retreats 2 to 3 times a year for men. We do classes. We have an online men's group of about 400 men right now, where we, teach about relationships. We teach about the shadow. We teach about getting to know yourself deeper. But really, the benefit of it is developing deep friendships that actually nourish and serve you as a man with other men. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So I'd say those are the places.
Love it. We'll put those links in the show notes as well for people.
Great. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Casey. All right. Let's transition now over to my conversation with Will, my husband, who has been in the process of learning how to be more self-aware, more honest with himself, and ultimately with me. He's really been in an active process around this over more like the last year or so. And this really wasn't instinctual or natural to him. So it's been a little challenging, but as you'll hear, very rewarding as well. So welcome, lovely husband.
Hi.
Good to have you here.
Glad to be here.
So let's talk about it. I specifically wanted to talk with you to just get a personal experience of, it's been a journey for you in learning how to do this better, as it is for all of us, I think. Learning how to be more honest with ourselves, learning how to be really honest with our partner, learning how to be sensitively aware, as I've called it. And I thought it would be useful for both my women listeners and even their partner to hear a little bit sort of from the inside what it's like, what that journey is like, what's been easy, what's been hard, why it's been worth it, all the things. So my first question for you is, has it been valuable in our relationship for you to learn how to be more transparent with your own self, more honest with yourself? I think is the easiest way to put that.
Definitely been helpful for sure. I think much of my life growing up, I had this sort of false, I am good. I'm fine as is. There's nothing wrong with me. And then it was through you, really, and just realizing that all of that was not necessarily true, that by being honest with myself and really looking at some of my flaws and that there is work to be done, it just opened up a whole new world of relating specifically with you. And the benefits of that are countless. It's just less conflict and more connection. I think it's as you said, it's kind of like a muscle that I need to learn how to just to get stronger. It's something that was never really shown to me, and I see the value in it, and so it's definitely been good.
Well, it's interesting that you said that you'd never thought of that there's something was wrong with you. And I think it's interesting, that you're, even now, as you think about being honest with yourself, that means you having to admit something's wrong with you. I still don't think something's wrong with you. I think you're very human.
Yeah.
Right? So what did you not, until I came along and encouraged you to see parts of yourself, what were you doing instead?
That's a good question. I think, there were certain things that I was just sort of either ignoring, or I think there's a lot of ignorance. And then, I did have my own doubts, but it was more not necessarily in the relationship and how I related to people. It was more just my own sort of inner insecurities and whatnot, about whether it's my own sort of creative output or whatnot. But in terms of communicating and relating and just being aware of some of the things. I mean, there was just certain areas that just had never had any kind of light shined on them. I always considered myself a great communicator, but I realized that was not the case. There's certain aspects that I'm good at communicating at, but in terms of, interpersonal, intimate connection, holding space, being present, truly listening to listen rather than listening to like come up with a response. Being married is not the same as like being on a debate team.
We need to quote you on that one. Wisdom bomb.
Yeah.
No, but it's fun, like just listening to you now. Like you are like, this is kind of an example of being honest with yourself, being willing to look at yourself, being willing to admit and see and admit things about yourself. So I appreciate like right now that you're doing that. And it maybe is more reflecting on the past versus this, like, I think sometimes it's hardest to do it in the moment. Yeah. Like to be honest, transparent, authentic, and open with yourself, to be honest with yourself in like when you're put on the spot. Right. Or like if I'm like, okay, so we have a funny example for you the other day. This is a very like non-serious example, but my lovely husband Will has been on a journey for a while to learn how to be especially sensitively aware to what's going on inside of himself, right? Especially honest with himself. And I've made it a little bit of a project to support that. Yeah. And so we, at certain point, decided I might ask him questions sometimes to help him start to notice what's going on in him in the moment. So like if I notice something or if we're having a conversation, I might be like, hey, so I don't know. I don't know how I've done it. I don't think I have a great way of doing it yet. But the other day we woke up a little late because we were on our anniversary trip and we were sleeping in. And do you want to say what you said? I said, what time is it?
And I said, 8:08.
No. How did you say it?
I don't exactly remember how I specifically said it.
Try to imitate.
8:08. Something like that.
Okay, so and all of us very sensitive people, right? We pick up on tone so much. So I was like, he said it in this funny way. And I was like, and I could tell there was like meaning infused behind it, right? Like it wasn't just like this neutral, it's 8:08. It was like, it's 8:08 or something. And I was like, I'm curious. Or I said like, I forget what I actually said. I asked you something
you said, what is the intonation behind that?
Yeah, what's the intonation behind that? Right? And at first you were like, what do you mean? Like there was nothing. It was just nothing.
My neck was bent weird.
Oh yeah, that was your excuse. My neck was bent weird. Which was part of it, right? But then we ended up having this whole kind of funny conversation about it. But now it's a joke between us. Like that this is like the symbol for being honest with yourself. Because after a little while, after some slowing down and you really taking a little time to reflect, and you didn't want to at first. You're like, this is insignificant. This is dumb. I don't want to think about this. Right?
Well, yeah, because I mean, I think, to me, just answering the question about what time is it, there's nothing. My first sort of surface impression was there's nothing behind it. It's just I said it and it came out funny. But, in hindsight, due to Hannah's prodding, I kind of realized that, I paused for the briefest of seconds before answering and was at the moment, still early, hadn't even gotten out of bed, no coffee. I was like, there was the briefest moment of like, oh, I need to say something witty. And due to the slowness of first early morning thoughts, couldn't think of anything witty, so I just responded in a weird way, 8:08. It was more almost like it was, it wasn't like a frustration about like, oh, we're wasting the day or...
Which was what I thought it could have been. That was kind of my guess.
Yeah. And so, in hindsight, if I had sort of paused at the onset of the conversation and the question, I might have been like, oh yeah, maybe I was just trying to say something witty, but was kind of couldn't think of anything, so responded in a weird way.
Yeah. And so I just think it's a really good example, because when we're talking about being honest with yourself, maybe some of you as listeners are like, what are they even talking about? And I think this is just a good example. Like, it doesn't have to be something, like, it doesn't even matter what his intonation was in that moment, but because we've been kind of actively working on him building this muscle, or he's been actively working on it, that's kind of where that all came from. But it is a good example of like what we're talking about, like what's behind the things that we do. What are the thoughts and the feelings ultimately behind our actions? And that's something we so often aren't aware of or are unwilling to look at.
Well, yeah. So this example is a prime example of basically, it's a very small and insignificant event, but it's good practice for something more substantial. Maybe there's a bigger disagreement or, criticism or whatnot, mm-hmm. that by, repeatedly doing these small little things, eventually it'll be more natural and instinctual when it really matters.
Mm-hmm. So for you, do you want to add anything else about why it's difficult for you think, even now?
Yeah, I think sort of touching upon what I was saying earlier is that, a lot of my life I sort of lived this, I had this, pretty healthy sort of self-esteem, confidence, and this was like, didn't think there was much wrong with me, even though we know that, it's not necessarily wrong. It's just there's certain tools that we as men don't know how to use. So I think it's just sort of, it's a bit humbling to realize that there's something that we're not good at or that we haven't been taught, but is essentially critical in how to be a man. It's almost like we feel sort of shortchanged in terms of whether it's our parents and society have sort of denied us this element that is seemingly, I think, essential. And I think you might probably agree with me.
I think it's essential. I mean, for the most happy relationships, it is. But I mean, one of the things that I'm kind of reading between the lines of what you just said, you said the word humbling. But if you were being even more honest and transparent with yourself, humbling, what does that mean? Like, there are some emotions or some difficult emotions that you have to face in yourself.
Yeah.
So what are those emotions?
I think it's a sort of a feeling of like insufficiency. I don't know, maybe there's a little bit of shame in there.
Yeah.
But, just not being good enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a hard feeling for anyone to feel.
Yeah, I think especially us as men who are like, oh, we are the providers, we're like supposed to like provide everything, and if there's a certain aspect that is almost maybe more important than food. I guess food is important, but
something that you're not, an important thing that you're not good at.
Yeah, I think it brings up those emotions that, we're conditioned to sort of like just stuff away.
Right. So like taking out, I mean, for me, and certainly I talk about this with my clients, certainly for my clients too, it's a human thing. And I think it can be exacerbated in men because of conditioning, but it can be hard to like look at the harder aspects of oneself. And that oftentimes does come accompanied with shame, with insufficiency, with not good enoughness, feelings of those things. And most of us don't like feeling those. And so it can be in some weird way easier to just not look.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think as I was saying, it was just kind of an ignorance. You just want to like, oh, bad feeling, going to ignore that. Just going to go out and like go for a jog or, do some work.
Yeah, totally.
Clean the dishes.
It's like emotional avoidance, ultimately.
Yeah, for sure.
So how have you then because you have been getting better at being honest with yourself and being self-reflective, especially in those harder moments. How have you handled any of these harder feelings that might be coming up when you do honestly face yourself?
Well, I think I realized that, certain aspects of it are not necessarily my fault. And just to sort of be like, okay, I'm having this feeling, but also realizing if the feeling will pass, and just sort of taking a mindfulness approach and looking at it objectively and just like feeling it, stepping back, breathing. And then, once it sort of maybe subsides a little bit, looking at it in a little bit of more analytical way and being like, okay, well, what happened? And I think using a lot of the tools, sort of the general coaching tools that you have taught me to just, let it pass and then process it and move forward from there.
Yeah, one thing I've seen you do, particularly when some of those emotions are stronger, is like giving yourself some space and some time.
Yeah.
And then I think you oftentimes are able to come back to me being able to be honest and being able to be more self-reflective and sort of sharing that with me.
Yeah.
Has it been worth it?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I feel the me now versus the me 10 years ago, I think you'll probably agree with me, is dramatically different. Even just in the last, a handful of years, the work that you and I have intentionally done, and specifically me, in terms of just like being more aware of myself and like how I respond to whatever trigger it is, in a way that I think is conducive to harmony in our relationship versus like trying to, I mean, I wasn't necessarily the most antagonistic person to begin with, but like, just pausing, stepping back, being present, and just really just ultimately being, honest with myself. So, but yeah, it's definitely been worth it. I feel much more capable as a husband, as a general, just a person who can relate to anybody.
I also hear it's made our relationship better, but I also hear you saying you feel even better about yourself. You feel more genuinely, deeply good about yourself.
Yeah, totally. I feel like approaching sort of like the culmination, there's 43 years of growth and learning and just wanting to be at a point in my life where not getting any younger, but just wanting to be better as a human. And it's not just like strength or whatever, but it's like, it's the mental, emotional, spiritual aspects where a lot of this comes into play.
Well, it's funny. It's like kind of ironic too, because like, I think the thing that people are afraid of, right? And you even shared is like, let's ignore the hard stuff about myself. Let's not look at what might be difficult and imperfect and flawed about myself, right? But now that you're willing to do that so much more, you're actually feeling better about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
It's kind of ironic and awesome. And I think that's certainly how I feel too, my own self. As I've grown better at it, I feel like I've been able to kind of like the full spectrum of who I am in a much bigger way. One of the things that I find that's beneficial about this is I think you're sexier.
Yeah.
What did you just say a quote to me today? Like an attractive man? No.
It's like an attraction is what draws people in. Physical attraction is what draws people in, and mental attraction is what keeps them engaged.
It keeps them attracted.
Yeah.
And I think that's so true. Like for so many of my clients and my own self, it's like your emotional vulnerability, your ability to be like, hey, I'm not perfect. And like, I see that I'm not perfect. And if there needs to be an apology and if there needs to be some stepping up and some owning some stuff, like that is so sexy, so much sexier than denying it.
It's not these big muscles.
No.
I don't actually have big muscles.
So.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's like, even like what you were saying is that vulnerability and that honesty. It's a more wholesome feeling, sort of like self-esteem, self-confidence that I feel than I am able to bring to our relationship versus just like this more sort of like false,
deflective,
confidence.
defensive.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just, it's just more genuine. It's more whole. It's more real.
And I'm able to feel much closer to you.
Yeah.
Honestly, because it feels like, whole and true and real versus like pretending.
Yeah.
And defending. So do you have any, just from your own experience, do you have any tips for other men or women or humans around how to be more sensitively aware and self-reflective and honest with yourself and your partner?
Listen to your partner. Like, listen to listen. Take time and space for yourself and quietude. It's hard to be honest with yourself if you're constantly surrounded by distractions. Just quiet time alone in your head, no music, no TV. Well, you could be exercising or something. That's what works for me.
One thing that helped the other day when you were with the 808 thing, I think when you finally got it, I asked, like, what were you thinking? Like, what were the thoughts that were going through your mind right before you said 808? Right? And that's where you were able to, like, actually see that little snippet. Because that's so often, it's those thoughts that we want to see, that we want to be honest with ourselves about. Because our thoughts lead to our feelings, and our feelings lead to our actions. So, our feelings are going to be the reason we say something harsh to our partner. We say 808 in a weird tone, right? So if we can trace it back to the exact thoughts that were going through our heads, that's a beautiful way to start to see and be honest with ourselves. Mm-hmm. But that's just one tool, and I like your suggestions. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it just takes time and space.
Yeah.
At first, the better you, I'm super good at it because I'm so practiced, right? Like this is one place my muscles are strong. Yeah. But it can take time to build those muscles. So in terms of you and I, how would you ideally like me to support you in growing that muscle? And is there a gentle way that might work for you when you're forgetting or having trouble?
Yeah, I think there's, like the other day, for instance, if you had been like, hey, sensitive awareness moment, what was the intention behind your statement? Even if just that little sort of disclaimer, maybe right before that would have made it so that I wasn't feeling like I was taken off guard. I think that's the hard part for me. It's if any kind of training is going to be hard, I think. If you're training for a marathon, it's not going to be oh, this is fun and easy, but ultimately the reward of it's going to be amazing. Just training for being, your transparent, authentic and open muscle. Mm-hmm. Starting out is going to be hard. It's going to hurt a little bit. So at least it's the kind of thing where it's maybe there's sort of as I said, just a little bit hey, moment of practice. What was, even just that I think would be helpful for me. It's
a reminder of what it is.
Here's what's coming. Even if it's just 2 seconds after you say that, so it doesn't feel like I'm completely blindsided by it. But ultimately, I think even regardless, if you don't do that every time, it's just just knowing that it's not going to be easy, it's I don't walk away from those experiences being oh man, I don't ever want to do that again. It's okay, yeah, that was challenging and uncomfortable for a minute, but ultimately I see the reward in it, and I see the benefits.
I need to make a note right now, which is that Will has agreed to this, and he's chosen to work on this part. And I wouldn't recommend that you listeners take every moment you can to every moment you read something into your husband's voice. That's not what we're trying to say, is always take the opportunity and try to figure out what he's, make him see, right? Or use that as an opportunity to train him. No, if he's open to it.
Yeah. If you did that every single time.
That wouldn't be good. Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd want to share or add?
I think just all of you out there listening, just let your partners know that you got this. It's not rocket science. It's well worth it. It's hard at times, but it's totally awesome. Highly recommended.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on.
And thank you to all of you out there listening. I just appreciate each and every one of you so much for wanting to grow and wanting to create more connection and love between you and your significant other. Before I hop off, a quick favor to ask: if you've been enjoying the podcast, it would mean so much to me if you could leave a rating and review over specifically on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It'll take 1 or 3 minutes of your time and help this information, this knowledge, reach more people and make a difference in their lives as well. So thank you so much for doing so, and be oh so well.